Today, you are joining the 5 misconceptions of software supply chain security webinar. And actually, before we kick this off, software supply chain is uniquely challenging because it's the responsibility of those who are building the software that goes into our supply chain. And it's also the responsibility of those who are purchasing the software that comes into our businesses to make sure that we are safe from software supply chain attacks and other types of threats. So as such, I'd like to kick off a poll before we really dive into the content here to understand who all is in our audience. Are you producing software? Are you consuming software? Are you doing both or neither? Which is a totally fair answer. And in fact, I'm gonna let this poll stay up
Uh-huh.
as I
Yeah.
introduce myself and oops, actually no, the first is RL at a glance. I'll actually hold off for a second on this. I love to
All
watch
right.
these. It's like a race.
Yeah. It's kind of fun that it's live, the kind of live numbers here as people click on things.
I'll keep this up to the
Looks like
side for a little bit longer. Yeah, go ahead, Knox.
I was just gonna say, looks like we've got, oh, here we go. We're up to 50%. We're up to 50% participated. All right.
So as we trickle in and answer the questions, I want to just talk a little bit briefly about who is Reversing Labs, the host of this webinar. Here at Reversing Labs, we have the largest searchable threat repository, 8 times larger than the next largest. And you might not know this, but a lot of the cybersecurity companies out there are leveraging us when they can't simply convict a piece of malware. So we are working behind the scenes with all these vendors, and that's part of how we're able to analyze 20 million files every day. The other way that that's possible is because we are fast. We are able to deconstruct files larger than anyone else, break them down to their smallest parts, and understand the threats that lie within them. And we're also able to provide context like MITRE mapping, our conviction, threat levels, and the like. We're identifying about 3 million pieces of malware globally or daily. We have 300 employees. We're a 5-star rated partner program. Gartner is recognizing us as a software supply chain security solution. And one that I'm especially proud of is we are a contributor to the Verizon DBIR report. The voice you're hearing now is myself, Dan Petrillo. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing at Reversing Labs. And I am joined by my colleague and friend, Knox, our Senior Cybersecurity Strategist. How you doing, Knox?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here.
All right, cool. So the way what we're going to do this is we're going to go through the 5 misconceptions. We're going to talk through why people feel this way, and usually it's for pretty good reason. The market can be misleading, vendors can be misleading, threat actors are changing their ways. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to then continue on to help you understand what you can do about software supply chain security at large and how we can make sure that these misconceptions are not misleading us to the advantage of the threat actors. Does that sound like a good time for you, Knox?
Oh yeah. Oh
Cool.
yeah.
Let's dive right in. All right. So, first, if it is needed, I'd like to put up some numbers here that illustrate the point that I think we're making, which is a lot of us are missing the mark when it comes to software supply chain security. And threat actors are recognizing this. In fact, they're swarming to this as a attack vector that is increasingly successful against the modern security stack. In fact, threat actors love software supply chain attacks if they can execute on them because they work against even the most well-equipped organizations fairly often. We're seeing an increase in these types of attacks by 742%. This is from Gartner. We're seeing an increase of the cost of these attacks by 200%, another Gartner statistic. We're seeing an increase in SSCS threats by 1,300%, Gartner as well. And then we're also seeing that 70% of companies are reevaluating their SSCS strategy. So based on this stat, more than likely, someone in this audience, a majority of you, are reevaluating your strategy, probably while you're here. And we'd love to give you some foundational knowledge that can help you rebuild your SSCS strategy to be as efficacious as possible. And then last, the Verizon DBIR report from this year noted that 68% increase in software supply chain attacks are stemming from software vendors. This is kind of contradicting the notion that it's open source that we need to focus on, and that the commercial software is also a big part of the problem. Another a teaser to one of the misconceptions. Knox, anything you want to add, or should we dive into these misconceptions?
No, let's just dive right in. I think we're going to hit everything we need to as we go through them.
Agreed. So the first one, source code is the way. I already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I think a lot of folks believe that if they don't have source code, there's no real way other than maybe a questionnaire or something similar to understand if there is risk associated with their software. Or even worse, some folks think that source code is more capable of providing the information you need to understand the threats in your software than maybe the complete binary would be. Knox, I'd like you to react to this
Yeah.
as organically as possible.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. The thought that comes to mind is I think the big misconception right off the bat is just even what source code is. Source code is when you have code, right? Source code is written in a way that humans can read it. And then when you compile the code into a binary, you're modifying the code into what computers can read, which is binary, right? So we think that source code is this nebulous, unreadable thing that there's just no way to know what's in it. But that's completely wrong. The whole point of compiling it is just making it so that your computer can read it and understand it. So what we do is we know how to read it. We know how to read the binary, and so we just take the actual binary and we read it. But the misconception is there's no way to do that. And like you said, people then want to fall back on questionnaires and to me that's just silly. I mean, just look at the binary. It's
Yep.
right there. I think people just don't know it's possible, and they don't know how to do it. They don't know what the tools are that are out there to even be able to look at a binary. And we've been doing it for 15 years now, so we kind of know what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think this audience in particular, this is why I love the poll. A majority of us are software buyers or both. And without access to that source code, if you think that that's the only place you can turn, you're left with not a lot of options and not a lot of avenues towards dealing with these types of threats. It's kind of you bring this software in and hoping the vendor was honest, hoping they're reputable, but every vendor is honest and reputable. It's not about that. Oftentimes they're not even aware of
Yeah.
what might have made their way into the code, and we'll see why that is in some of the following misconceptions.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and tease a little bit here. The problem is that you may scan that source code. We're not saying that scanning the source code or checking the source code it doesn't have benefit. There is benefit to it. The problem is that it can be manipulated after it passes out of the source code phase and into the binary phase, either in the build process or even after the build process. It can still be manipulated, and so you can't trust it at the source code point in the supply chain and then just think that from there on out it's going to be fine. There's other points along the chain you're going to have to check.
Yep, exactly. So I would say the binary is the way. And let's move on to the next one. The next misconception that we're often running into is that software composition analysis equals software supply chain security. But I think that it's important to note that SCA is only dealing with open source. And we teased this a little bit before. A lot of these breaches are stemming from commercial off-the-shelf software. Knox, how do you feel about this misconception?
Yeah, it is. I think I don't know why we think that somehow the commercial software is immune or protected from a supply chain attack, and the only open source is vulnerable to it. Um, what we're forgetting is that when we look at like the really big attacks, you look at like your SolarWinds, you look at your 3CX, you look at other large ones that have happened. Usually, it has to do with either a developer or the entire platform of that company getting compromised. The bad guys have gotten inside, and then once they're inside and they have access to that CI/CD pipeline that's developing the code and then compiling it and giving it out to the end user, That's where they're doing it. They're injecting their malicious code somewhere in that pipeline before it gets distributed to all their users. And so we all know that is possible, right? And especially if you're a great target. I mean, think about this. As a hacker, I could try to sit here and come up with some kind of amazing distribution method for my malware. Usually it's, oh, I want to get people to download this thing. I want to make it appealing. I try to say something's free. Or if I want to do the long game, I could figure out how to infiltrate some enterprise and sneak my code into their product and let them be the distribution for method for my malware. And now not only is it a great distribution method, that piece of software is trusted on that machine, not to get ahead of ourselves. And that piece of software can now get into places that I can't get into with traditional malware. So it's worth the effort to the bad guys to try to find a way into your supply chain and to infect it so that you can be the distribution system for them.
That's so well said. So, I would say here SCA is a part of it.
Yeah.
It's maybe half, because it does not acknowledge the commercial off-the-shelf software. And once again, it doesn't do service to the consumer of software.
Mm.
The consumer of software, when it comes to software supply chain security, are reliant on questionnaires, surveys, maybe pen testing. But I know that if you're consuming a lot of software, you can't do a thorough pen test on every single piece that comes in or every single update or patch to every piece of software.
Yeah.
And so the options become very, very limited, especially if you're one of the businesses who or some of the people who are perpetuating this misconception.
Yeah, and especially if you're the end user. So as I look at our poll here, I see that we have people who have indicated that they are end users, they're a software consumer. A lot of several people have said they're both, they're producing and they're consuming. If you're consuming it, uh, you have to have something that can look at that whole. You're going to look at the binary and you're going to see what you can find in it, and you've got to have a tool to be able to do that. If you're producing, then yes, you can look at the source code, you can look at all the open source libraries. It's a lot easier. And I feel like what we end up talking about here is this SCA is a lot about not shooting yourself in the foot, right? Like making sure that you're not including things, the low hanging fruit that was just dumb to put into my code. Like, oh, that's a bad Python library. Oh, that's a bad NPM package. Like this one's been compromised and I don't want it in. That's the low hanging fruit, right? And that is traditional shift left. But again, the misconception here is that is going to be enough. And what
Yep.
we're trying to point out is that there are many more stops along that, you know, pipeline train. I think I just mixed my metaphors there, but along as it moves down, and you've got to check those areas too, and you've got to
Yep.
make sure that the whole supply chain is being watched.
That's so true. I think what we want to suffice it to say is basically software supply chain is part of SSCS,
Hmm.
but it is not the whole thing. And considering it the whole thing is going to leave you incredibly vulnerable. Another equals one. And this one is one of my favorites. The S-bomb equals safe. Knox, how do you feel about the S-bomb equals safe?
Yeah, this one drives me nuts as a misconception. So let me just tell a little story here, okay? When I used to work in the federal space and did federal contracting on a platform, as a platform engineer, and there were some we'll call them misinformed individuals who thought there was something magical about an S-bomb, and they would ask us as platform engineers, like, "Well, are you getting an S-bomb for that piece of software?" And we would say, yeah, we made the S-bomb, and they were like, oh, good, and then they would just leave. And we're like, well, we have this S-bomb, but what do you even know what that is, or do you know what we're supposed to do with it? Like you literally just want us to get an S-bomb, and you're happy with that. So for those who may not be aware, let's explain just real quick what an S-bomb is. Okay, so it's a software bill of materials. Okay, software bill of materials, and what that means is that when you have a piece of software, it has many other pieces of software that it is built upon to build that piece of software. In my case, it was containers, and they wanted a SBOM for the container. So every little piece of software in the container, because you can do that too. So all you're getting is a list. And I love our picture we have here, because the SBOM is exactly this. It's just like the nutritional facts on your bag of Cheetos. We'll go with a bag of Cheetos because that sounds good this morning. Um, Not good for me, but good. So the bag of Cheetos, if you look on the back, has ingredient information, and it tells you what a serving size is, and it tells you how many carbs are in it, and how many other strange ingredients that my body probably doesn't need are inside the Cheetos. And when you create an SBOM for a piece of software, it's going to tell you all the different components that make up that software, but that's it. The nutritional guide on the Cheetos can't stop me from eating the Cheetos. The nutritional guide can suggest that I should work out. It will not. It doesn't even do that. Like, none of those things are on there. They leave it to you. You just know the list of ingredients. So what I'm trying to say is that an SBOM is just a list, and now you must take action on the list. You either have to like look at it, have a different piece of software that can tell you that there's CVEs or there's different problems with those ingredients, but the SBOM itself doesn't do anything. It only gives you a list, and then from there you must build out and get other tools and find ways to use the SBOM to make it actionable. But on its own, it's not actionable.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I think I want to make it clear that here at Reversing Labs, we love the
Yeah,
S-bomb. We
it's
think
very
it's
important.
foundational. We can generate S-bombs for you. And if you want to talk about how we can do that, we'll do that another time. But I would argue it's two steps away from being safe. The first step is taking that list of ingredients and understanding, pulling from that, what is a risk. The second step is acting on those notions. Only
Hmm.
when you understand what the S-bomb is telling you, and oftentimes that takes a lot of expertise, time, analysis, or a tool that's dedicated to it,
Or some
um,
kind of feed.
or some kind of feed, and then you need to act on those notions to either rev your software, if you're on the producer side, to address these things, or on the consumer side, work with your vendor, or, and we've seen this a lot from our customers, make product selections based
Hmm.
on what the SBOM is telling them.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing on the vendor side, you can use this as a differentiator. If you can provide a report that says, hey, this isn't just an SBOM, we've taken it, we've understood the risk associated, and our software has none. If you can't decide between two, maybe don't pick the one that has evidence of tampering and malware and vulnerabilities.
I just figured it out. So you're going to say your software is the one with no MSG, or my software is the one with no
There
artificial flavorings or colorings. Like my
you go. Yeah.
software is organic.
Yeah. Organic pasture raised software. You know how we like it here at Reversing Labs.
Nice.
Hey. All right, next one. Zero Trust has me covered. Um, I think this one it's coming up quite a bit as zero trust is, it's a 10-year-old term. It's a 10-year-old framework. I genuinely think its 10-year birthday is like around now,
Coming
perhaps.
up.
Yeah, coming up. And it's for good reason. It's a good framework. It says that we should not implicitly trust anything in our environment. And it tends to be around implicitly trusting identity or implicitly trusting east-west traffic, ports, processes, applications from running this and that and the other thing. And it can provide great coverage. But a software supply chain attack is the Achilles heel of zero trust. Because what these threat actors are doing is they're taking the fact that they're embedding their software in an application that you are trusting, that is being downloaded from a trusted source by a trusted user, executed with privilege because we trust this thing every step of the way. Even if you have the most robust zero trust framework in place, a software supply chain attack, unless you alter your definition of zero trust to mean like trusting what's within the binaries themselves and doing deep analysis, a software supply chain attack is going to bypass a zero trust framework. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think, I like this rain analogy here that we have going. and it probably is worth a little bit of explaining. I always talk about cybersecurity is a second order chaotic problem. Now, in order to understand what I mean, I need to contrast that with a first order chaotic system. A first order chaotic system is like the rain. If we attempt to predict, or like the weather rather, if we attempt to predict the weather and we determine that it's going to rain and we bring out an umbrella, it is not going to rain sideways or upwards to bypass our umbrella. And that's what a second order chaotic system is. It's one that reacts to our attempts to predict it. And that's the problem with cybersecurity. Every time we react to a new type of threat and put in processes and tooling and individuals to deal with that threat, the threat actor is going to change up their strategy, change their techniques. That's why MITRE has a massively growing number of techniques because threat actors have to keep changing their game. That's why the first malware doesn't exist anymore. It's not working anymore. Threat actors keep changing their game. And software supply chain attacks are a prime example of it. They've been around for a while, but they're changing the way in which they execute on these attacks, and they continue to succeed in a way that is bypassing our frameworks.
Hmm. I'll give an illustration here. Again, because I'm a platform guy, I immediately think of like platform illustrations. But for instance, if you have a container that's running in AWS, the smart way to kind of authorize that container is you create a trust relationship between that container and AWS, and every couple minutes they talk to each other, and they check and like, oh yes, I trust you, container. Yes, I trust you, container. And it happens every few minutes. And if that authorization that's required from AWS simply doesn't exist in that container anymore, then it won't talk to it anymore. But the problem is that assumes that container is going to stay safe, right, and going to stay non-malicious.
Mhm.
But if somehow malware is injected into the container, AWS doesn't know it, and as long as that mechanism that keeps authenticating every couple minutes keeps happening, it'll just be a malicious container that's authenticated every couple
Yeah.
minutes. And
Yeah.
the same thing can happen with a binary. If you just have a straight binary and you update it, let's say you've been using it for years, and then somewhere in that vendor's supply chain away from you, they are infected. And now you pull in that update because you trust the update, you don't really check it, and then you just update it because we've all been taught, oh, I must always be on the newest update as soon as possible because the update is how I protect myself. I'm going to patch, right? But what if the patch is infected? So then the infected patch comes in, you update your software, and now you just go along like you've always gone along, and it's a trusted piece of software. But little do you know that trusted piece of software has now become malware, and it is either harvesting or it's downloading other things, or it could be exfiltrating data, it could be doing all kinds of things.
Mhm.
But that's because the software itself is trusted. And now that it's become the vehicle, we'll say, for the malware, that's why the zero trust doesn't work. You can't just rely on that. You have to continually check the binary itself. There has to be some way that you're checking that binary to make sure that it hasn't changed and that it hasn't gotten infected either through differential or through hash or through whatever means you're using. But there has to be some way that you are checking it on a regular interval as well.
Yeah. And maybe it's as simple as a redefinition, zero trust 2.0, right? That
Yeah.
includes that level of checking. But yeah, let's jump to the final one because it's kind of related, which is that endpoint protection platforms and antivirus. And by the way, I want to include, next gen antivirus, EDR, XDR, MDR, all those types of detection and prevention centric technologies that are typically running on the endpoint. The misconception is those are enough to deal with the software supply chain attack. And Ragnar here is actually what you need to deal with the
Yeah.
supply chain attack.
Ragnar
Not,
Ragnar is here to tell us that the endpoint protection and AV are not enough. They are not enough at all. In fact, Ragnar's here to illustrate the fact that if the file is too big, the most antivirus just ignore it. So Ragnar here, because he's a little bit bigger than most, they would just ignore him and let him pass through. But all jokes aside, some EDRs go as small as 9 meg. If a file is larger than 9 meg, they don't scan it. because a lot of next gen AV and a lot of endpoint protection, that's what they say. Every time a file is updated on your system, we're checking it. We're getting that hash and we're going to run it up and we're going to make sure everything's fine. But what they don't tell you is if the file is too big, it just gives up. Give up. They're doing it on small files, but they're not doing it on big files. And it depends on the EDR. Some of them get to a little bit larger, but around 100 meg or something, they're all going to conk out, because for them, um, being an endpoint company, think about it, if you have thousands of endpoints trying to send files that are 100 meg up to get scanned, that's a lot of bandwidth, and they can't pay for that, and they're not charging you for that, so they just don't do it.
Yep.
Um, so the thing is that this is where you have to take matters into your own hands. You have to know what software is going on your machine, and you have to have some other way to be able to check these large files to make sure that the large files aren't infected, where these guys have just given up and said, "Oh, it's too big. I don't know," and they come back with just a non-verdict. It just says, "I don't know if it's good or bad,
Yep.
but it's on the system now, so good luck."
Yeah. To
Kind of
fail
tells
open
you.
because the file is too big is wild,
Yeah,
frankly. I mean, there's also other issues too, right? Like AV and NGAV, the scans are relatively surface level. So
yeah,
if an issue is embedded deeply within a file, it's going to miss it. And also in the case of EDR or XDR or MDR, they're looking for this thing to start behaving or acting maliciously such that they
yeah.
can detect that. And in the case of a software supply chain attack, if this software is distributed broadly, if it has landed on their targets before it starts exhibiting that malicious behavior, it's we talked about this before, Knox, a day late and a dollar short.
Yeah. Yeah, because it'll take here's the thing. So that your software update, let's say it's a well-known piece of software and an update comes through. Update is malicious, but no one knows it yet. It hasn't presented that it's malicious. And so the hash gets read into the system of this EDR or AV. And so now that hash is trusted. So that hash comes in, it's like, oh, it's just the update for that thing. So nothing happens. You get an update. Now, some company, some crack security team at some Fortune 100 company gets this software, and after a day or two realizes that it's doing something bad inside their environment, and then they have to now think about the clock. The clock's on. Okay, we have now established that this piece of software is bad. Now I have to try to contact, reach out into my circles of security people. I have to try to get to the EDR companies. I have to tell them what I've seen. I have to prove that I'm not crazy, because this commercial software, that would be bad if I say if it's malicious and it's really not, and I just didn't understand it. Now a day has passed. Now we finally figure out, oh, it's bad. Now, the AV and EDR companies have to update their hashes and their stuff. It could take another day, and now all of your systems have to update. We could be on day 3 of this attack before all the EDR and endpoint protection actually catch up with everybody else, with what is actually known and out there. And that's scary, right? Like, you don't want to have to go days with the bad guys being able to run around your system and probably have already harvested everything they were looking for anyway. They just wanted to grab credentials, they started stealing data, they started looking around, they may have embedded themselves in some other way and found some other backdoor. So yeah, that's not what you want.
Not at all. And I think things have gotten a little dark. So let's turn to what we can do about it here. And
Let's
to
go
the individual,
positive.
let's go positive with it. And to the individual who asked if the 5 misconceptions are in one place, here they are. They're in one place. So feel free to take your screenshot or write them down. But again, as I said at the beginning, we're gonna go somber. We're gonna talk about all of the problems and the misconceptions, but we're gonna end on a high note. We're gonna talk now about, like, what can we do about this, right? Once
Yeah.
we understand that those are misconceptions, what's wrong with those lines of thinking? How do we shift the way that we think about these things and, more importantly, act on these new notions around software supply chain security? So the 6 recommendations, we got 5 misconceptions, but even more recommendations because the good will win, are first, we want to identify the 6 risks associated with our software binaries, and I'll detail those on the next slide. Next, we want to crash the whole car. And that's a fun analogy that I'm going to wait until we get to that slide to explain. Third, we want to go beyond the S-bomb. I think we talked a little bit about this already, but we're going to explore exactly how you can do that and what that means. Next, we want you to be able to operationalize an SSCS strategy as a producer and as a buyer. And in this presentation, I've put an example of how to do it as a buyer, which I think is perfectly well suited to the audience we have here. Next, we want to remove the implicit trust that we grant to the software that we bring into our organizations and that we ship. And then last but not least, we want to suggest that we get proactive about this.
Right.
So the 6 risks. A lot of folks think about software supply chain and they think vulnerabilities. And for good reason. We don't want vulnerabilities. We want to know about our vulnerabilities. We want to patch our vulnerabilities. But inside of our software binaries, there's a lot more than that. Worst case scenario, I would argue, is there's malware present. There's also, if there's evidence of tampering, then there's a good chance that someone's working towards the next, household name of a supply chain attack. There's also going to be opportunities for hardening. I guess the risk is softness, right? Areas that are not explicitly a vulnerability, but some kind of configuration setting that doesn't need to be that way and is causing risk to your organization. And then if there are secrets or licenses present, this might be more of an issue on the producer side. But if you're buying software and you find, they've got secrets in there or licenses in there, it might be indicative that they don't have the best software production practices. So we highly recommend when it comes to software supply chain security, consider the full scope of risks that can be included.
Yeah. And Dan, I just thought of this right now while we were doing this. So get ready. Okay. People are looking for vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are where we have identified a weakness in the software that allows the bad guys to exploit the software, right? Hardening is, to me, things that could lead to a vulnerability or an exploit, but have not been identified yet. See, it's very important. You want to look at your software, and just because somebody hasn't found a way to exploit or hasn't actually, because to get a vulnerability, you have to actually prove you can exploit the weakness. But
Yep.
the hardening are things that could lead to someone being able to exploit. They just haven't been revealed yet.
Yep.
From a security researcher standpoint. So you want to know that. You want to know if there's something in this software that is weak and possibly could, but just it isn't known yet. And then tampering is it's already been exploited. It already happened. It's already in it. That's at least the danger. When you see the tampering, you need to really look at it and say, whoa, what got tampered with, right? And does this tampering show us that something has already infected it? Because you're right, people want to look for vulnerabilities. That's saying I could get exploited. Tampering means it could already be exploited, and hardening could be things that just haven't been cataloged yet, or no one has done the research to see if it's a real exploit yet. By the way, that's what leads to 0 days,
Mhm.
right? Like the hardening could be saying, look, there's weakness in here. Like literally, nobody said that that's a problem yet, but it could be. So it's really important that you need to know that. Sorry,
True.
that just kind of hit me while we were talking through those.
Love that. Thank you, Knox. I totally agree. And I appreciate that context. Um, let's jump on to the next one. Crash the whole car. So when it comes to and this one's very much related to the misconception that SCA equals SSCS. You want to have a mechanism in place that is going to test the entire software package after its final build is complete. Because there are other things that happen that aren't covered by SCA. Artifacts are brought in, the behaviors become more readily present. And for that reason, while it's important to develop your code and along the way, have checks in place that allow you to test that code and make it as clean as possible, you don't want to just have a car where they tested the wheel and tested the axle and tested the door handle, but didn't test that all together when it crashes, because there's going to be things that you learn from crashing the whole car, or in moving away from the analogy, from testing the complete binary, that are not going to be present until that final build is complete. Anything else you want to add to this analogy, Knox?
Just the idea that again, you can't test like when we're testing the car here, you can't test these things in a vacuum, right?
Hmm.
Like if you test the airbag by itself, like just a steering wheel and an airbag. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to get data, but it's not going to give you the same data as if you actually test it in its actual crash situation, right? So, and we've seen this. This is not just an analogy. We've seen this in um, supply chain attacks before, where the attack only happens if it's actually in a real environment and certain conditions are met, and then it goes, right? So even during the build process, sometimes these supply chain attacks will hide themselves, and we'll know if they're actually in a build, if they're in some kind of isolated environment, or if they're in a real end user machine. So it's very important that we test it in a way that is natural or expected.
Too true. Yeah, great point. This one I think we got into quite a bit at the misconception phase, but we want to encourage you all to go beyond the S-bomb. We are not saying do not use S-bombs, do not collect S-bombs. You should absolutely have an S-bomb, but you need to go beyond. You need to say, what does that list ingredients tell us about the risk? And then how do I act on those notions? If you can get from an S-bomb the six risks as detailed on the first step, and then you can start to iterate to address those risks, then you're going beyond the S-bomb. You're not subscribing to the misconception that S-bombs equals safe, and you're starting to make great strides towards avoiding any potential for a software supply chain attack in your org. Knox, like I said, we covered this one pretty well at the
Yeah.
misconception phase, but is there anything you wanted to add?
I think the other thing is just remembering that you can. So when you look at this SBOM, you are able to start trying to have informed decisions about, do we need to have mitigations? Do we need to, or do we need to reject this piece of software? Maybe it's even that I have to have special mitigating, controls around the software. Like maybe this software is vulnerable in some kind of way, and that's okay because I know about it, and I'm going to build mitigating controls around the software to protect it. So what we're saying is that the SBOM informs you to make decisions
Hmm.
and informs you to be able to check your risk appetite against what is actually in where you've just used the word appetite for risk appetite in the ingredients, right? Can your appetite handle it, or is it like, no, that's not a thing? But maybe it needs salt, right, or pepper. But maybe you have to have controls around it to be able to use it. So that's what we're trying to say. It is just a list. Now you have to do something with it.
Absolutely. I love that. Way to take that analogy, I think,
Keep
as
the
far as
analogy
it can
going.
possibly go. Yeah. Um, all right. So another one we wanted to talk about was, we want you to consider how you're going to operationalize your software supply chain strategy, security strategy. And talking about these things is the first step. It's a great first step, addressing these misconceptions, changing the way we think about this challenge to be up to date with the latest and greatest threats and technologies. But we really want to make it clear that there is a path forwards towards operationalizing this. So here I have an example on how an enterprise buyer could operationalize this. And here, we are talking about something that ReversingLabs is proud to offer, called a product called Spectra Assure, that uses a technology called complex binary analysis that's going to reveal those six risks from any software binary, no source code needed. And it's going to put them in a way that is easy to consume and understand, even for some less technical folks. But just consider this an example of a way to operationalize SSCS. So you have a software vendor, you purchase from them a brand new piece of software, or you update or patch one that you have. You are, in this example, a GRC, TPRM, IT, procurement, and you don't yet know if you have appetite for this, or it fits within your dietary restrictions or your diet. You'll run it through a tool like ours. You will be presented with the six risks, and depending on your appetite, you will have a few options. You can either say, approved, this is perfect, I can eat this. It doesn't have shellfish and it's delicious.
Or nuts.
Or nuts and it's really good. And you deploy it. Caution says, well, it doesn't have shellfish or nuts, but it's got way too many calories. Depends if I've exercised today. And stop is it's got shellfish and nuts. I'm going to go into anaphylactic shock. We need to contact this vendor and get them to deal with it or consider another vendor. And we have examples of customers who have had for the first time their vendors have changed their software, fixed their software rather, because of what we were able to show them in relation to the six risks.
Yeah.
This process can be applied to the software vendor. We left it out for the sake of time here today, but in the same way that you run your software that's coming in the door through this, you run your software as it's going out the door through this. And once again, it's approved, and instead of deploy, it's ship, and then caution and stop. Anything you want to add about, especially from your days as a practitioner, Knox, operationalizing SSCS?
Yeah, what's great about this is we have APIs because no one wants to do this manually, and we get that doing this manually is rough, but we have customers who have already automated this process to the most part, right? There's obviously points where human intervention come in, but you
Mhm.
can automate the task of grabbing the update. You can automate the task of sending the update to get scanned. You can even automate the task of looking through the SBOM, looking through all those six areas, looking and seeing and having policies in place or thresholds in place where programmatically you can just say yes or no,
Yeah.
right? And then you may now right there at that juncture where you've got approved, caution, and stop, that's where usually you have a human who looks at the report and the recommendation coming from the automation, and the automation is saying, yeah, I think you should approve this and here's why, or the automation says, no, this is failing because it's failing this policy or this thing or this thing. And we've seen customers go so far as to have the users can fill out a form and throw the binary in the form and then just hit submit, and it goes through this whole process. They've built this process around our product and are able to very quickly decide if something should go into an environment or not go, or if updates should be approved or held on to. That when we talk about operationalizing, that's what we're talking about. The ability for a security team or just an IT team that just needs to watch over their whole environment to be able to take a tool like this and be able to use the APIs provided to create automated steps to save them time and also know they're protected.
Yeah, I'd say automation is the final form of operationalization,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that should certainly be your goal. Okay, remove implicit trust. So this one, of course, applies to the zero trust one. I think that a lot of businesses who have zero trust in place, which is no easy feat getting to the traditional definition of zero trust, are still thinking of their software binaries this way. If an AV scan, or they trust the vendor, or they've used it before, they're saying, hey, I trust this thing, looks fine, let's deploy broadly. If you remove that implicit trust, take a closer look at the software that you consume and the software that you ship, and become aware of any malware, tampering, suspicious behaviors, or the like, then you're removing that implicit trust. And as we talk about this webinar, I think it's probably worth, let's redefine zero trust. Because again, I love zero trust. If you Google my name, I'm talking about zero trust all the time. I'm a huge proponent of it, but I have always worried about software supply chain attacks. And I think, it's worth redefining zero trust to be inclusive of removing the implicit trust that's within our binaries, recursively unpacking those binaries down to their smallest components and seeing if there's something that should not have been trusted within a zip, within a zip, within a zip. That's what zero trust should be taken to mean in this world where software supply chain attacks are so on the rise.
I agree.
Cool. And our grand finale is get proactive. We don't want anyone to find out a supply chain attack is present in their environment as a result of it exhibiting malicious behaviors, or conversely, that they've shipped a product that is exhibiting malicious behaviors. We know that software producers are not malicious people, and we know that this can happen. So we really recommend to be as proactive as possible, to give a thorough assessment, to crash that whole car before it goes out the door if you're a producer, and before it gets deployed when you're a consumer, to remove that implicit trust, to look deeply within your files, to look for those six risks, to operationalize this process. And here at Reversing Labs, being proactive comes in the form of a SAFE report. That's a software assurance foundational evaluation that is going to present the six risks to you, that is going to give your software a score, that is going to give you details on issues, vulnerabilities, malicious files, that is going to give you a path forwards towards fixing that software. We'll do things like map to MITRE, tell you about behaviors that are present. We're going to allow you to download that SBOM, even though we've gone way beyond it for you. We
In
understand that
more than
for
one format.
clients, and more, yeah, Cyclone DX, SPDX, you name it, we'll provide it for you. We know that there's regulations out there that are requiring you to gather these. We don't want you to have to go and ask your vendors for these every time you get a patch or an update. We want you to be able to get them on your own and instantly. But I want this taken to mean in a more general sense. Just please, we encourage you to be proactive about software supply chain attacks. We believe that this is the greatest threat in software in cybersecurity right now. This is where threat actors are going. They are reacting to the tools we've put in place, and this is their last ditch effort to not last ditch effort. Of course, there's many attack vectors, but
Next
one of
wave.
their favorite vectors for its success rate against the tooling that we have, against the EDR, XDR tools that we have in place. And being proactive when it comes to the software supply chain is probably the most important recommendation we have. Knox, anything you want to add before we conclude and take it over to questions in our
No,
final minute?
yeah, I think we've covered about everything that we could possibly cover, but it really is that you have to think about these things. And especially if you were in charge of environments with large, numbers of machines or just a lot of software that all your users are using, you can't just trust the vendor. We've seen already this year in a couple of very notable either attacks and or mishaps, and we all know what I'm talking about, where because we just expressly trusted the vendor, it can bring you to your knees either because of a mistake or it can bring you to your knees because of an actual attack. So you have to start thinking about these things. You have to get proactive. You have to worry about the continuity of your environment, and the way you're going to be able to do that is to be able to have a system where this is part of your security, overall strategy is what I'm saying.
It's got to be part of the strategy. I think
Yep.
that's well put. Awesome. Well, with that, we have a few minutes left for questions. I'll go ahead and check the Q&A panel. Here we go.
So far, we're just doing a great job of explaining everything.
Yeah, okay. Here's a question. What types of files are you able to analyze? Um, that's hard to answer. I think there's over 4,800, right, Knox?
Yeah, there are over 4,800 file types that we're able to unpack and look at. There are data and it's not just the binary. It's the binary. It's also data formats that we're able to look at. We're talking like images and just all kinds of different formats. We don't care because it's binary.
Yeah.
So if you've got it, then most likely, I'm not going to say every time, but most likely we probably cover it.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the ways that we stand out is in our ability to leave nothing behind. And we're continuing to expand on that. We've recently brought on the ability to scan entire VMs, which is incredibly powerful for a lot of our customers.
Yep.
And very soon, I'm just gonna do a spoiler here. We're about to announce our ability to scan pickle files, which
Yeah.
is the format that most ML models are leveraging. And let me having trouble getting to the Q&A for some reason. Okay, here we go. What are your thoughts on how to have RL scan vendor patches that endpoints connect direct to vendor CDN to auto patch, i.e., monthly patches.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
I
go
mean,
ahead,
if
Knox.
I had to guess, I know one of the ways that we had to do things like that was we had to have a little DMZ like environment. So you have to have like some kind of small subnet with some machines that you're using whatever gold image or whatever you're using in your environment. And so you have to have a way to download those patches to machines that are isolated and they're in their own little environment. And then once those patches are downloaded, you've got to run all your scans and do all your things kind of in a bubble and in its own little DMZ area. And then once all the tests are good, then you have some kind of automation that you throw or whatever you do, and now the rest of all your machines that are regular, normal everyday environment machines can pull that patch in. But it kind of stinks when you have that kind of setup. It's supposed to be out of convenience so that you can just automatically patch everything. But again, as we've seen this year, automatically allowing patches without any human intervention whatsoever from a third party can be bad every once in a while. So you have to have some kind of mechanism to be able to block it or at least hold it back for your regular machines. And then you have to have that small environment that you bring it in, test it, make sure everything works correctly, and then open the gates for it for the rest of your environment.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, Knox. Another question is simply, what about OSS? So yeah, I think we talked a lot about how it's really important to scan commercial software, and that open source software is often it's dangerous to myopically focus on that. But we did not intend that to mean that you should not be scanning your open
Yeah.
source software. Absolutely do. And in fact, here at Reversing Labs, we have a free tool to enable you to do that. If you just head to secure.software, you can take a look at open source software and you can see a report much like the one we showed on that previous screen to help you understand the risk that may be associated with that. And we've just put a link to that, secure.software, in the chat. So go ahead and check it out. We absolutely want you to be comfortable with your open source software and addressing it.
Yeah, and we need to point out that that is I guess the reason we don't bring it up is for us, it's our table stakes, right? Obviously we are scanning all of the open source software as well. And when you look at the report that Dan had up earlier from Spectra Assure, all the open source components are in the SBOM. They're all of the CVEs from your open source are going to be there. So we're scanning everything equally with equal scrutiny, the open source and the commercial pieces.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, well, that's all the questions for now. I want to take a moment before we all leave and check out the survey at the end to talk about what else is coming down from the Reversing Labs webinar and demo perspective. Next is October 24th. I'll be back again with my colleague Joe Coletta, and we'll be talking about the survival guide to managing third-party software risk. Then a few days later, we're going to have Paul Roberts, our director of editorial content and Reversing Labs, and Knox, who you know well by now, joined by Chris Romeo, the CEO of Davici, talking about supercharged threat modeling with modern software supply chain security. And then on Halloween, just before you go out to trick or treat with the kids, or even without the kids, who says you need them to get some free candy, we'll be doing a live demo on Spectra Assure, the complete approach to software supply chain security, so you can know when your software is malware. So if you were intrigued by any of the ways that we recommended that you might deal with these misconceptions, you want to see it live, there will be a demonstration not far from now. And Knox, am I right in thinking that that is you as well?
Yeah, it is. That's me too.
So that deserves your picture. There's no one better to get a demo from than Knox. So I encourage you to check these out. So with that, I thank you so much for attending. Please do fill out the survey at the end. We'd love to hear your feedback and know what you enjoyed and how we could improve. Yeah, Knox, thanks, man. That was fun.
Thanks for having me. Always a good time.
All right, everyone, take care.
See you later.